Thank you, and I hope you all are enjoying the festival. I know it's really hot on this side, so those of you can come and stand on the other side. It's an absolute honor to have with us, and I'm going to address him as Sir David Hare because he was gonged, even though he doesn't want to acknowledge it. And it's wonderful for any theatre lover anywhere in the world. I think it's extraordinary to have him here. David, when you, in your book, The Blue Touch Paper, and I hope you all will go out and pick up a copy of 50 odd productions, 50, 55?
40, I think 40 plays and 30 films.
40 plays, 30 films, a lot of controversy, love life. So that's also there. All of the gossip that you want to read is right in there. And who he wrote nasty letters to, which was published in the Sunday. But David, you wrote after a particular difficult production that you would never write if you didn't have an idea in your head, and you would never write for money.
Yes, I said I'd never write. It's a vow I made as a young person because I didn't really think I was a writer. I accidentally discovered I was a writer. I was originally a director in the theatre. And because we had no play to do, it was necessary for somebody to write one. That was Wednesday, and we had to start rehearsing on the following Monday. So I had to write a play in 3 or 4 days. So I didn't really think of myself as a writer. I was surrounded by very, very great writers because I was the literary manager at the Royal Court Theatre, which was the best new play theatre in London. And so I thought, well, if I write, I'm only going to write if I have something to say that I think is very important. And secondly, I will never write for money. And it's actually been incredibly easy to do this. And the reason it's so easy is because I sense I would be absolutely hopeless at writing anything unless I believed that it was the most important thing being written at the time. Now, you may say that is completely delusional and that I live in my head to a ridiculous degree. But when I'm writing, it always seems to me uniquely important to me. Now, this is only I have been asked to do all sorts of things. For instance, George Lucas asked me to write episodes 4 and 5 of Star Wars. And I had to say to him, first of all, I said to him a joke which he did not think very funny. I said, "Oh my God, George, does that mean I have to watch the first 3? But then I said, I would be absolutely hopeless at that, and you would hate what I wrote, because I can't write, as it were, a commercial job. I just can't do it. Now, that doesn't mean I don't admire commercial writers. There are great commercial writers who are incredibly skillful, but it just happens to be not how I work.
Is there money in writing, especially for theatre, 50 years later?
I think Alan Ayckbourn, who is a writer of comedy, says that he's the only playwright in England who has lived entirely off the theatre and been able to live entirely off the theatre. In fact, a number of us could have lived. I could have lived entirely off the theatre. I think Tom Stoppard could have lived entirely off the theatre. Probably Alan Bennett could have lived entirely off the theatre. The fact that we have chosen not to is because we're also extremely interested in film and television. And I would regard some of the things, Andrew O'Hagan has just given a wonderful lecture on the importance of literature. But it was notable that he did not mention television as being literature. And yet there are very, very few novels that reach the heights of Heimat or The Sopranos or great series like this, which seem to me the literature of our time in a way that very, very few novels approach. And so I've always been as keen to write for film and television as I am for the theatre, quite apart from the joy of reaching so many more people.
And at which point of time, and you write about it in the book, that you discovered that you were actually good at dialogue and setting it all up?
The play that I started on a Wednesday was just an hour long, and it was given to the actors on Monday because I had a company and I had to give them something to act. And the play was absolutely terrible. But when they looked at it, all the actors just said, Yeah, I can say this. This sounds fine. I can say this, and I won't sound an absolute idiot when I say this. So I discovered that I had a gift that I didn't know I had. And I say to any young person, not specifically about the theatre, not specifically about literature, not specifically about anything, that it's always worth trying something to see if you... I had had no intimation that I was a writer until I was 21. And so I think that anybody may discover in themselves a gift they didn't know they had. And all I can tell you is when you discover that gift, and it may be the ability to climb mountains or ride a horse, nevertheless, discovering a gift you didn't know you had is more or less the greatest human pleasure there is, I think.
You're talking about actors. Are they necessary for a theatre? At some points of time, you've sort of taken issue with actors and the way they've presented some of the work that you've written.
No, I deliberately chose a collaborative form. I love working in a collaborative form. For me, there are two, if you write a play, there are two most exciting days in the whole process. The first time is when you hand the script for the first reading, as it were, as I've been lucky enough to do. You hand it to Judi Dench, you hand it to Ralph Fiennes, you hand it to Bill Nye, you hand it to Tony Hopkins, and they invent what you have written in a way that you had not possibly imagined. You go, oh, I had no idea he or she was going to play that like that. They're adding something that you, in your imagination, could not possibly reach, but they see it completely differently. Now, if you don't welcome that process, be a poet, be a novelist, work in a private form. But we're the people who have to love that process. We're the people who enjoy that process. And the other thing we enjoy, or rather fear and enjoy, is the audience. So we don't know anything about a play, really, until we put it before the audience. So for me, the most exciting night of any year, any time, is the first preview of a play. When you first preview a play, you suddenly discover what the play is, because the audience's gaze, their reaction, their feelings complete the play. And so I've used that expression, the play is in the air. It's not what happens on stage, it's not what happens in the auditorium, it's what happens between. It's the interaction between the way people react to it and what it is. I recently was citing, because Judi Dench is 90, believe it or not, can you believe this? And somebody asked me to tell an anecdote for Judi Dench's 90th birthday. And when she did Amy's View, which was a play of mine, she did not know why she had been cast. She did not like the part. She did not understand the part. For 6 weeks, the director and I talked to her, and we were like football commentators trying to influence the game from behind a screen. She just didn't know what we were talking about. And she was terrified when she went on for the first preview. And when she played the first preview, she came off exhilarated and said, "The audience gave me the play. I now understand the play because the audience's reactions told me who my character was." And that completion that happens through the people in the audience is what makes playwriting most exciting. It also makes it most terrifying, because there are plenty of times where the audience stares at you like you are mad to have written what you've written.
And you've talked about, or you've written about how on a preview night you're sort of waiting with bated breath, and sometimes you sort of melt into a puddle because they haven't laughed at a particular point or they haven't received what you've written. Do you then tweak it? Do you go back with new lines for your actors?
No, actors do that for you. I mean, what's wonderful about actors is they have fantastic sense memory of a performance. If you talk to an actor after a first preview, they will say, "Oh, they were very quiet in that scene," or, "Oh, I noticed how they reacted in that." I once went out to dinner with an actor immediately after a preview of a play, And a couple of people came up to him to congratulate him and said to him, oh, we really loved you this evening. It was actually the director, Mike Nichols, who was acting. I was directing Mike Nichols in a play. And Mike Nichols said, yes, you enjoyed most of it, but I noticed you weren't paying much attention during such and such. And he'd seen a certain scene, and these particular two people whose attention had wandered during that scene. And that's what an actor's doing all the time. They're monitoring. They're monitoring what's happening. They don't come off the stage thinking, I was absolutely fantastic. They come off the stage thinking, what happened there? Why did that happen? Why was it like that? And the redemption of being a theatre actor, unlike being a film actor, is you can do it again tomorrow night. A film actor is condemned to hell forever. If they mess a part up, then 20 years later, some streamer will be showing it and people will be mocking you for your terrible performance and what you got wrong. But the redemption of theatre is, tomorrow night, I can do it better.
When you're on the road, when you're traveling with your plays, different venues receive the plays differently, and you've had this experience and you've talked about it. In one place, it'll be warmly received, and in the other ones, completely cold. Does that theatre as well, the actual infrastructure, have a role when you're designing and writing a play?
Yes, of course, because theatre tells you a lot about what's happening in the culture. We're talking about 40 years ago now, or 35 years ago, but Plenty, which is a play of mine about an SOE agent who is flown into France during the Second World War and then finds the peacetime United Kingdom in which she has to live boring and unsatisfying compared with being a special agent in SOE in wartime France. In Japan, when this was performed, and I'm talking about 35 years ago, all the men left at half-time, and the women stayed. And I asked the audience, are the men leaving because they hate the play? They said, no, they are leaving because they object to the fact of a play being about a woman. There just shouldn't be plays about women. Plays should be about men. Whereas the women were all staying and crying at the end of the play because it was so unusual for them to see a play about something they recognized. Now, there's an equally disgraceful story which tells you something about America, which is that more recently, when I wrote a play called Stuff Happens about the diplomatic process leading up to the war in Iraq, in Los Angeles, after the first scene of the second act, flip, 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 seats were going up, people were leaving. And they were leaving because a Palestinian was telling their idea of the invasion of Iraq from a Palestinian perspective. And again, we asked people who were leaving, are you leaving because of what the Palestinians said? And the people in Los Angeles said, no, we're leaving because we object to there being a Palestinian on the American stage. So you learn something about a culture by the angle at which it's being received by the audience. And sometimes what you discover is very ugly, as I think a society which will not tolerate listening to a Palestinian is ugly.
Much of your writing has been looking at politics of the time. And you write about how in the 60s and the 70s, Britain was still obsessed with the war or coming out of the war, and how that in many ways shaped the way you wrote. And of course, we'll come back to your boarding school days separately. But tell us a little bit about politics and theatre.
Politics and the theatre? I suppose I went into the theatre because I didn't like what I call bell jar plays. And plays are plays which pretend that there is something called universal human nature. Yes, of course, you can write a play in which you say, it's absolutely tragic, we're born and we're going to die. So we take it for granted that life is tragic in that way. But there is a certain amount of suffering which is avoidable, and a certain amount of suffering which is unavoidable. Some suffering has to happen. In other societies, if you organize the society decently and have it decently led, a huge amount of suffering can be avoided. Now, for me, the line about how much we have to suffer and whether suffering can be avoided is the greatest subject of all. It's, for me, the great subject that I suppose I've spent my whole life writing about. Did this have to happen? Why does it happen? And to me, we cannot pretend that a Chinese peasant working in the field at this moment is feeling and understanding and experiencing exactly what I'm experiencing as a writer in North London in the West. We're different. And when we write, to me, we have to respect those differences. Yes, there are things we have in common. Of course there are things we have in common. But I don't want to write without any sense of history. And history must blow through the room. Meaning, for me, a good play is a play in which you have some sense of what's happening outside the walls. And you have some sense of how people got to where they are and in what context they're appearing. That's called historic. It's not called, I suppose you call it epic theatre. It's not necessarily political in the narrow sense, but it is epic. And I get quickly bored with plays that are just about, in quotes, universal human truths. Because frankly, those universal human truths run out pretty quickly.
You talked about, I mean, you're one of the few playwrights, David, and film writers where you've written from the women's perspective. But for you, that never seemed to be odd. You always came from that space. How and why?
I suppose because I started writing, you know, I'd been to an all-male boarding school, and so, of course, when I came out of an all-male...
Where you were first stripped when you got in.
When I what?
When you were first stripped, where your trousers were taken off.
Yes, it's true. I'm trying to work out the relevance of that, but I'm sure, I'm sure it has. I'm sure it has some relevance to me psychologically, if not historically. But you know, at the time I came out, first of all, I discovered women and understood that they had feelings that were different from mine and a perspective on the world that was different. And also feminism was clearly on the rise, and at least in the West has been one of the more successful political movements of my time. If you look at the achievements in the West of what feminism has achieved since the 1970s, it's pretty substantial compared with most political movements. It's one of the more successful movements. And so the moment I came out, it just seemed to me conspicuous that the theatre was always putting the man at the center of the stage and the women at the side. And I wanted to put the woman at the center of the stage, partly because I was fascinated by women, but also it's very hard to explain, but in order to write, you must leap with imagination. It's very uninteresting to write about yourself. I've no interest in writing about a writer who lives in England and is a man. I've absolutely no interest in writing about him. Whereas I've got a lot of interest in writing about somebody that involves me in an active imagination in trying to work out what the other person is. And nobody can be more other from me than a woman. So that's the active imagination that excites me and inspires me.
Is there a formula for, I mean, 40 plays down the road, have you found a formula for a successful play? How does it work? I mean, you have the cats and the phantoms and so on and so forth, but in this kind of writing, what is that makes a play successful?
Almost certainly the one thing that is absolutely essential is collaboration. You have to be with good collaborators. There is no such thing as a successful play that has not been realized by a director who has something to bring to it and actors who have something to bring to it. You choosing the right team that's going to take your play beyond what you've imagined is the absolute necessity. And I've been very, very lucky. I've worked with the greatest actors in the world. They've been in my plays. They've been in my films. There is no end to the great actors who've been in my work. And they've been the joy of it. But basically, a play is a speculation. Or when I write a play, it's a speculation. So I go, here is something that is rattling around in my imagination. And I think it's fantastically important. And implicit in the play is the question, do you? When you have a successful play, then you can see the light in the audience's eye when they go, I have always felt this, but I've never heard it expressed like this. I've never seen it as clearly laid out as this. I've never gone as deep into this as I have with the thoughts and feelings that I'm listening to on the stage. That sort of play is successful because people will go to find out something that they have been worrying at in the back of their minds, but they have never been able wholly to express. That they will go to. But I've also written plays where I have thought, this is fantastically important, and the audience has responded with a totally blank look, as if to say, I know he thinks this is very important. The specific thing I'm thinking of, I wrote what I thought was a completely brilliant play about alcoholism and about the two different ways of treating alcoholism, which are either to surrender to a higher power, as they do in Alcoholics Anonymous, or to exercise your own free will, as you do in Rational Recovery. What a fascinating subject, I thought, because it's the most important subject of all, which is, can we exercise will, or should we surrender will? What a fabulous question. Nothing from the audience, just blank, staring looks. And the play has been tried many times in many ways. I thank anybody who's persisted with it. It always flops, but thank you, because I think the subject's important, even if the audience doesn't.
Scenographers as well, when you first put your show on at the Littleton at the National, you had a scenographer who was fantastic. It didn't quite work on the first night where the machinery didn't work. But then once it worked, people went away with the snow falling, with Plenty.
Yes, I mean, Plenty was really my play, you know, which I owe everything to a producer called Peter Hall. And Peter Hall was the architect of post-war theatre. And he said, when the play Plenty, which is the one about the SOE agent I was talking about, which starred Kate Nelligan on the stage and then was made into a film with Meryl Streep, then when that sort of flopped on the first night, Peter Hall said the whole purpose of subsidized theatre is to persist with things we believe in. And the board was telling him to take it off because it was only playing to 50% audiences. And he said, I will not take it off. I will play it on Fridays and Saturdays, which are the best theatre-going nights, and I will protect it, and it will build its audience by word of mouth. And so doing, it ran for 8 months, and by the end was full and getting standing ovations. And that was entirely because Peter Hall insisted that there was something called art theatre, and that art theatre was more important to him than commercial theatre, and that he had a duty to look after new writers who worked in his theatre. And I owe everything to his faith. And I wish I saw as much of that faith in young writers now in the West that I was the recipient of 40 years ago.
When the National first opened, there was a lot of criticism that you faced by other playwrights who said that the National is going to sort of steal all the funding from small players who are touring the country, and that this was a very bad idea, and it became a political thing.
Yes, I mean, I was forced to defend the National Theatre because it did take money away from the regions. And if you look at the theatre now, it is in London, it is very, very prosperous in central London, and almost not, it's so short of money outside London. And so the people who protested against the idea of having a centre to British theatre, I'm afraid, are historically vindicated. And people like me who believed in a national theatre, because I believed, like Bernard Shaw and all the people who helped found the National Theatre, Granville Barker, I believed that there should be a theatre which was an art theatre, not a commercial theatre. And yeah, we paid a very, very high price for that. It's true.
Theatre traditions itself evolve. I mean, fast forward to, we're now in the 2020s. What makes a successful play? Everything is very commercial. It takes a lot of money to set up a production. What's changed, and have you also therefore changed the way you've written or you've created new work?
No, I'm incapable of that. I've tried to explain that I'm a total victim of my imagination. and I can't do anything that my imagination doesn't tell me to do. I'm just a zombie who executes what my imagination tells me. I have no idea why I'm drawn to one subject and not to another. When I wrote Via Dolorosa, which was about a trip that I made to Gaza and to Israel, and I performed it myself as a monologue, then a number of people came to me and said, "Oh, can you now do Northern Ireland? Can you do the same thing for Northern Ireland?" And I couldn't explain why I wanted to do Israel and Gaza, but I didn't want to do Northern Ireland. It was the same when I wrote about the Chinese Revolution. A lot of people came to me and said, "Now can you do the Russian Revolution, please?" And I can't explain any more than a painter can explain why certain subject matter appeals to them and other subject matter doesn't appeal to them. It's what you might, I have a word, theatrogenic, which is the same as photogenic. I see the picture there. I see the play there. But when I say I don't mean my conscious mind. I mean my unconscious mind, my imagination, over which I have no control, says that would be a great thing to write about. So I'm a victim of that, and I'm afraid I can't change my ways. It's too late.
Much of your writing in the early times was really presented in places like the Traverse and, of course, the Royal Court later and at the National. The generosity in many ways of Hines at the Traverse or Sir Peter Hall at the National allowed for you to be able to present that. Do you see that sort of continuing as a tradition, or do you see now everything is about the money that's required and the box office that has to pay back?
Look, if you write films, then you are used to the idea that the films that get made are the films that are the producer's idea. If you go to a producer with an idea, they don't like your idea nearly as much as they like their own idea. So they will get a book, or they will buy a book, or they'll buy a play, and they'll say, "I think this would make a fabulous film." And deep in their hearts, they believe it. And the reason they believe it is because they chose it. Whereas if you say, "I've written a film about such and such," they look at you going, "Yeah, interesting, yeah, but I didn't think of it. You know, it's not my idea." And so, unfortunately, the theatre, which used to take for granted that what went on in the writer's imagination is what drove the theatre, is now much more like the cinema. It's much more like television. There ought to be a play about such and such. You say at the moment, "Oh, I cannot count the number of people who came to me and said, 'Can you write a play about Donald Trump?' No. 'Can you write a play about Boris Johnson?' No. I don't want to. I've no interest in writing about them. Enough has been written about them. Leave them alone. Ignore them. Shut them up. Just you know, it's not me. So that more and more theatres are commissioning writers as if they were hacks, as if they were film writers, as if they were selling their labor. And this is bad, because all the great innovations in theatre come from individuals sitting alone in empty rooms and working from their own imagination about what they want to write about, not what they're ordered to write about. And this is what's changed in the theatre now.
The power of a writer, somebody like you can dismiss a director?
I beg your pardon?
That you dismiss a director?
Yes, I mean, when young people ask me, why should I write for theatre or film, I say, well, it depends on your attitude to power. And they're very, very shocked by this answer. But I'm sure there are lawyers in the audience, because God knows there are always lawyers in the audience. But, you know, lawyers will tell you, when I sign a contract in the theatre, I am the owner of the copyright. That means if I don't like the production, if they don't say the lines I wrote, I can close the production down. It's mine. It's my right, because I own the copyright to everything that happens on the stage. When I write for a film, unfortunately, I'm selling my labor. I'm just a person. And the likelihood is, on any film, there are 30 people who think they are better writers than you, because everybody thinks they can write. And so the producer has a perfect right, because he's paid you not to own the copyright. You don't own the copyright. You're contracted as a hired hand. And so one of the wonderful things about theatre, And why you go back to theatre is that in theatre, the playwright is sovereign. They are in charge. In film, no. You are simply arguing for your own point of view. And I've said this before, that on a feature film that I worked on recently, I spent 10 times as long arguing for my script as I did writing it. In other words, I now am a lawyer myself. I have to be a lawyer and advocate on behalf of my own script. And I have to do meetings in rooms with producers, financiers, director, actors. I look forward to that bit, but the first bit I don't look forward to, because all I'm arguing for is my version, and I have no legal right to insist on my version. In the theatre, I have the legal right to insist on my version.
David, you know, we're sitting here on the ground. It's a live interaction between the audience and ourselves. It's quite different from being on the screen and what we used to do during COVID, for example, where you could have a conversation. The theatre, because of this kind of exchange of energy, there's magic. When that curtain opens on opening night or any night, there's a magic in the theatre. How do you capture that magic?
Well, you can't capture it, can you?
No?
I don't think, I mean, you know, that is what draws us all back to the theatre all the time, and why we, you know, you become dissatisfied because you seal things off and throw them, you know, you very rarely know the way the audience, I mean, you may go to a screening of a movie, but the destiny of a movie is very odd, and it's particularly odd because films take a very long time before people understand what they are. I mean, the reputation of films changes much more than the reputation of plays. So that a film, I mean, the famous film Peeping Tom by Michael Powell was dismissed as absolute rubbish at the time and is now regarded as one of the great classics of British cinema. Withnailed and I was not particularly successful when it first came out, is now regarded as the funniest and most acute modern British, of modern British films. Films, oddly, take longer to build reputations. In spite of them being such an immediate form, the reputation of a movie takes years and years and years. And the only, you know, one of the many benefits of streaming is that, that things get reputations much later. I wrote 3 spy films with Bill Nye about a character called Johnny Warwicker, the best known of which is a film called Page 8. And it was originally shown on the BBC. In the last few years, it's been on Netflix. It's been, during the COVID years, it was on Netflix and got a much bigger reaction 10 years later than it did when I first did it. Movies take a very long time to grip in as to whether they become classics or forgotten. And that's a very, very slow process and a frustrating process.
Is it difficult to hand over the play to an actor after you've written it and directed? How do you let go? Knuckle, for example, has had so many different variations. Do you go into the theatre and renew whatever and storm around and want to smack everybody around the ears?
I've never stormed around and I've never whacked anybody over the ears, but thanks for the suggestion. Because
you have fought with Peter Hall.
Yeah, but that was because I was an arrogant young man, and if anybody wants to know the history of my arrogance, they can read it in the Blue Touch paper, the biography. I think I was ruthless when I was young, and I've had a very interesting argument about this with Tom Stoppard, who is not my contemporary, but obviously we've been writing side by side for many years. Tom appeared with me in Jaipur, actually, together at this festival some time ago. And Tom...
Did you talk about the letter at that point of time?
We talked about lots of things. And Tom is someone who I've had very, very fruitful and arguments with about everything, but whom I love. And I once said to Tom, I regret my ruthless self, because I think because I faced so much hostility, I think I became a very unpleasant person. And Tom said to me, well, I admire your ruthlessness. My plays were often directed by people I didn't think were very good, and I didn't do anything about it. And I wish I had had your ruthlessness in looking after my own work with the same care and success with which you looked after yours. And I said, well, I don't find that a very attractive aspect of myself. And I said, I didn't always admire Harold Pinter, not as a writer, but as a man, because he was always had this endless grievance. Even when he'd won the Nobel Prize, he was still full of grievance about how badly treated he was. And Tom said this very wise thing to me, which rebuked me and which I think is totally true, which is he said, Harold Pinter was the person he needed to be to write the plays he wrote. And that forgiving side of Tom really put me in my place. He's dead right.
I'm going to open it up to the audience, so keep your questions ready. But before that, David, one of the things, I mean, to me, what really touched me when I started reading the book was a line you'd written about that you hated people asking you about happy childhood story kind of writing. What was the background to that?
What?
Happy childhood writing.
Did I say that? Because I don't know what the answer to the question, did you have a happy childhood, is. I had a totally absent father, and anyone in the audience knows who's had an absent father knows what having an absent father is like. You spend the rest of your life looking for a substitute without ever finding one, and I realized that I've spent a lot of my life looking for father figures who would substitute. My father was a sailor, so he was always away. But I think that Bexhill, which was a small seaside town, suburban, full of people, but long before post-traumatic stress disorder was ever invented, it was full of men who'd had a very bad war and were damaged by the war, but in those days didn't believe there was any therapy that could help them. And I was brought up in a town of peace and quiet and lower middle class. And that kind of background, where you're, as it were, not in the heart of the middle class, but one step back from it, is traditional writer's ground. It's a wonderful ground for a writer to be in, because you have access to everything, but you're not quite part of everything. And because I was a scholarship boy who ascended up through the society by winning scholarships, I won a scholarship to all my schools, I won a scholarship to university, I got an education my parents could not have afforded, it just gives you a perspective that is just one step back from feeling you belong in the very center of things. And it's always the people one step back who tend to be the writers, I suppose.
There's a memory that he shares about his birthday, and he's looking forward to his birthday. His father had come into town, but then they go off for a holiday themselves.
Yeah, I'm sorry to air this grievance. My father would be very shocked to know that, 70 years later, I was airing this grievance in India. But it is true that on my 5th birthday, a day to which I much look forward, my father, because he was back from sea for 1 month, got on the Vespa with my mother and disappeared off to France on that day and said, terribly sorry, I'm leaving on your birthday. So, if anything is likely to make you feel unloved, I recommend your father not caring a damn about either you or your birthday. It's great material to become a writer.
Questions? Ooh, there's lots of...
has everyone got fathers then?
Do we have mic? So let's start from the back. We'll take them in clusters so that we can get a few more. So the lady with the, go for it.
You mentioned about leaping from the imagination.
Could you bring your...
You mentioned about leaping from the imagination when writing, and wanting to write about women because you realised there was a difference and you wanted to learn about women. And I wondered, in recent years, conversation has gone towards you need to be this to be able to write this. You need to have this, be from this background to almost have a valid creative contribution.
Cultural appropriation, we got that.
So I was wondering if that is something that you have come up against in recent years, and if so, how you've
Okay,
navigated
so
that
have you
conversation?
come up against cultural appropriation or cancel culture in recent years? Yeah.
I think it's a very good.
Hold the answers. We'll take them. Yeah, yeah.
Hi, given all that you've said today, do you believe that the theatre has the power to effect social change?
Does theatre have the power to affect social change, and have you in recent years looked at cancel culture or cultural appropriation in writing? These two.
Oh, these two. The question about cultural appropriation is, I agree with Kate Blanchett, who said, I became an actress in order to pretend to be other people. However, it's not as simple as that, because the powerful have to be very, very careful when they represent the powerless. So the example I can give you is, when I wrote in Collateral, which was a television series I wrote with Carey Mulligan and Billy Piper that was on television maybe 8 years ago. And Carey had to interview an Iraqi refugee. So obviously I'm writing an Iraqi refugee. So I do everything I can to speak to Iraqi refugees. I do everything I can to make sure that I'm not being condescending. The actress who played the part quite brilliantly talks to me at length about what she feels about the part. In other words, I try to fireproof what I write and to have it informed by very, very useful people who talk to me and make what I write richer. I then put it out in the world, and if Iraqi refugees say he's got this completely wrong, they have the perfect right to say that. Again, one of the wonders of Netflix is that the series then gets shown in a part of the world it would not normally be seen in, and actually I've had a lot of reaction from Iraq, nearby countries, people who saw it saying, thank you for representing a refugee as a human being, not as a huddle of clothes and a poor, destitute person, but as a highly intelligent person who can hold their own against a British policewoman. And that, you have a moral duty, there's no question. If you're powerful and they're powerless, you've got a moral duty to do them justice. So that's all I try and do, is do them justice. As to the question of can the theatre affect social change, I have absolutely no way of knowing. I can see that it can put down a marker. Again, the simple example is when I wrote Stuff Happens, which is about the diplomatic process leading up to the invasion of Iraq, I wrote it in 2004. And my theory was that Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney had reacted to 9/11 with a piece of opportunism that had nothing to do with the Twin Towers. At the time, that was a hugely unpopular point of view. It is now accepted as history. And if you want to go back and find somebody who argued it as history in 2004, you can go back to Stuff Happens, and there it is laid out for you in the evening. So I hate that phrase, the first draft of history about journalism. I think it's horrible. But it is true that you can sometimes see underlying causes and roots that no one else can see. And that argument, at the time the play was hugely attacked, now there isn't a person who doesn't accept that version of history. So yeah, it nudged the change in which those events are seen. But compared with the desolation and suffering of the Iraqi people, a play is nothing.
Ela, Arun, and Salil at the back. Where are the mics? That's Salil. Salil, just wave your hand a little bit. That's Ela. And then Ela, Arun in front. Sorry, Tripti. Yeah, go ahead,
Yeah.
Salil.
So David, thank you so much. And I've seen Stuff Happens in London and Permanent Way. And it related exactly to what you just talked about, journalism and theatre, and which is the whole notion of verbatim theatre. And Gillian Slover is also a friend of mine. She has done a brilliant play on Grenfell. So I'm just curious, because you also spoke about the importance of imagination. To what extent does verbatim theatre imprison you to what people have told you? And where does a leap of imagination occur to take it to a different plane?
Hold that answer. Tripti Pandey in front.
can I make a request to you? And that is, can you please sort of say those few lines on Gaza that you yourself narrated from the stage? The Gaza narration, that, from the Israel, for him.
For you.
Can I what?
Can you read out from your Gaza? He doesn't have his the play in front of him.
It would have been great to hear you on that.
I know. I'd love to read out what the Palestinian says in the beginning of the second act of Stuff Happens, because it's so completely contemporary. I mean, I'm driven slightly crazy at the moment by the fact that I've written twice 2 full-length works about Israel-Palestine, and nobody in the British theatre has the imagination to revive them. Why they are not revived at this point, I have absolutely no idea.
But go for that question that Salil said about imagination.
Yes, I would say that, your imagination, you've got to feed it, and the way you feed it is going back to the street, which is what I've done throughout my whole life. I've spent my time, what I call, being rebuked by reality. In other words, a writer gets a nice little idea and, cooks it up and goes, oh, this is my version of events. You then go and talk to people on the street, and you find that they don't believe at all what you thought they believed. And so I have spent an awful lot of my time in police stations, with the clergy, in a slum in Mumbai. I've spent an awful lot of time trying to discover what is really going on in the world. I don't see that as a threat to my imagination. I see it as nourishment for my imagination. And I feel that if, like me, you're trying to write ahead of history, the reason I'm so contemptuous about writing about Trump is because if I wrote about Trump, I'd be behind history. I'd be way behind history. Whereas what I've always tried to do is say, you don't realize this is about to happen and become important, but it will become important. And to be ahead. And that, the only way of being ahead is by listening. And you have to listen to what people are thinking and feeling. And luckily, I've always enjoyed the reportorial side of being a playwright. I love it. And I love listening to people, and people just talking about their own lives, I find completely fascinating.
One last question, right at the back, maybe. We haven't gone to the back. Could you just stand up so they can see you right at the back here? No, the lady. A short question, please keep it crisp so that we can get an answer.
Sorry, I'm a big fan of your characters, such as Susan from Plenty. And have you ever felt challenged or hesitated while writing from a women's perspective as a man? As well as what have you done to do it better and write better from a women's perspective? Is it research or just reports?
Well, the truth is that, no, it's all guesswork. I've absolutely no idea what it's like to be a woman. How can I know? But it's pure guesswork. But I've seen feminism come and go in waves. In other words, there's very little that's happening in what I'd call judgmental feminism at the moment, or rather in the last few years, meaning women who say that men have no right to write about women. I lived through that before in the 1980s. The advantage of my being this old is I've seen fashions in political movements come and go. There are times when people are more puritanical. There are times where they're more liberal. There are times when people believe sex is liberation. There are times when people believe that sex is the exercise of power. And these fashions come and go in intellectual discourse. And we've obviously been through a period in which there's been a certain amount of talk about cultural appropriation. But frankly, I lived through it before. I went through all this in the 70s and 80s. And there was feminist criticism, particularly of a film I wrote called Licking Hitler. And that film was very much the subject of feminist criticism. There are other periods where women are just so pleased to see a man whose principal subject is women.
Ladies and gentlemen, Sir David Hare. This is a fabulous book. Much of his plays are also in the Crossword bookstore. David will be signing at the end of this session, so please do and pick up a book. Thank you so much.
Can I just say one word to thank everybody who sat in the sun through this? You are absolutely heroic, and thank you so much for sitting in that heat. It is hugely appreciated.